Welcome to the lab. Today we're building an in-drawer knife block that can hold a variety of different knives. The design can be customized to fit almost any size drawer. A quick note before we start the build, this design is heavily influenced by pre-existing in-drawer knife blocks. I start this build by chopping my 4/4 stock down to around 17-inch lengths. Once my boards are cut to the approximate length, I go ahead and mark the faces off with some chalk. That way, I visually can tell where the blades have made contact with the material. Then I head over to the joiner and planer and bring my boards down to 3/4 of an inch. Once my boards are square, I go ahead and rip them down to 2¼ inches wide. Once my stock is prepped, I can go ahead and make a template for the router table. I use Super 77 and attach my template onto a piece of plywood. For this template, I'm using 1/4 inch stock since it's easier to refine the shape. Once my template is glued onto my plywood, I can go ahead and rough cut it on the bandsaw. I'm cutting around 1/16 of an inch away from the line. I set up a cross-cutting sled so I can cut my walnut strips to final length. Once all my stock is cut to length, I use a white colored pencil to mark off where I need to cut on the bandsaw. Just like I did with the template, I go ahead and cut my stock about 1/16 of an inch away from the line. Once all my stock is rough cut, I can go ahead and double stick my template onto one of the pieces. I use a router bit that has a bearing on top so it can follow my template and cut my walnut piece to the perfect size. Router tables can be incredibly dangerous. Make sure you use push sticks to keep your fingers away from the bit. After I route my first piece, I switch over to using that as my new template. That way, I have a little more space between my fingers and the router bit. I use 1/4 inch stock to make my first template since it is easier to refine thinner material. Once all my pieces have been shaped, I go ahead and double stick them together. I find it's better to work in sections, that way it's easier to keep everything nice and square. I use clamps to increase the pressure on the double stick tape to ensure the pieces don't separate. Once everything is put together, I can go ahead and sand through my grits. I sand my parts as a single unit to make sure they all remain the same shape. Also, it helps eliminate the possibility of rounding over the edges. Once everything is sanded, I go ahead and mark my pieces so I can ensure I put them back in the same order, just in case there is a little bit of difference between one side and the other. All my parts will be held together with a thin strip of wood on the bottom. Here I'm setting up to run a dado on either side and one through the center. When cutting my center dado, I get close to center, run it through, flip 180 degrees, and run it through again. That way, I'm ensuring it's dead center. Once my dados have been cut, I can go ahead and remove the double stick tape and transfer my numbers to a spot that won't be sanded away. At this point, I go ahead and hit all my surfaces with 220 grit. Once my parts are sanded, I can go ahead and round over the edges on the router table using a round over bit. The last operation is cutting the slit in the center for the knife. For this, I use the table saw and a stop block. If this method is intimidating, you can always use the bandsaw. The outcome is nearly identical. Make sure your table saw blade or your bandsaw blade is sharp. That'll eliminate the burning in the kerf. Once the slots are cut, I go ahead and rip some stock that's identical to the kerf. These pieces will be glued in at the end of the cut we just made to keep the pieces from moving. My pieces were just slightly too big off the table saw, so I used the thickness sander to bring them down to final thickness. Once they fit snugly in the slot, I can go ahead and cut them down to 2.5 inch lengths. The spacers are glued in at the end of each knife block section. Use the glue sparingly since cleanup will be nearly impossible. I use a squeeze clamp to keep the part from moving and check square. Once the glue is tacked up, I go ahead and use 23 gauge nails for additional support. I remove the excess spacer material on the bandsaw. I use a belt sander to flush up the separating blocks. Make sure you don't oversand since this will damage your bevel. I use Timbermate to fill the holes left by the 23 gauge nailer. Once the wood filler dries, I sand it flush with the surface. I also take this opportunity to make sure all my roundovers are nice and smooth. Once my pieces are sanded and ready for finish, I go ahead and cut some scrap 1/4-inch ply on the table saw. These pieces will be used as spacers for the glue up. The last part needed for the knife block is some thin strips to fit in the groove that we cut on the bottom of each of the parts. For the block I made, the parts are 1/4-inch by 1/4-inch by 27 inches. It's better to cut the strips slightly longer than needed since they can be cut off after glue up. Time for the glue up. For this glue up, I'm using Titebond 2 Extend since it has a longer open time. I glue my knife holders down using glue very sparingly. I take great care to make sure the piece is fully seated in the dado, and I wipe off the excess so my spacers won't stick. You'll notice that there's a little piece of wood inside each of the kerfs for the knife. I place these here to eliminate any flexing when I go to clamp the piece all together. My bottom strips fit nicely in the dado and didn't require any clamping. If you find that you need some clamping pressure, just go ahead and weigh down the entire knife block. Once all my sections are in place, I use a couple bar clamps to draw all the parts together. The following day, I removed the bar clamps and removed the spacer blocks in the center. I found it was easy to remove these using an Allen key. I rotate my knife block and trim off the excess bottom rail material. I flush it up using a little hand plane as well as my oscillating sander. Before I apply finish, I spray my knife block down with some compressed air to eliminate any sawdust stuck in the pores. For finish, I've opted to use spray-on polyurethane since it's easy to get in between the grooves. In total, I applied 4 coats. Another option for finish would have been applying a wipe-on finish prior to the big glue up. And there you have it, a gorgeous indoor knife block. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time in the lab.